We are going to get started. I think people will still be coming in as we do the introductions and get going, which is fun. Tonight should last about an hour or so, and then at the end we have a small reception, so please stick around. We have snacks and wine, and you can speak more informally, which is always nice. So I want to welcome you all to the Inside Histories lecture series. This is the first talk of this semester, but it's been going on for about 4 semesters now. This is the 17th talk that we've had in this series, and it's a really terrific collaborative project between the School of Art and Design, History and Theory, where I teach design history, and my collaborator Joanna, who teaches in the School of Constructive Environments. So over the past few semesters, the series has really been an opportunity to bring together students and scholars and practitioners to think about the ways interiors intersect with lots of different disciplines and methodologies. I think for anyone who thinks about the interior, it's a very complicated topic, yet one in which we really interact with every day. And we've seen over the last several semesters how scholars and researchers coming in have really shed light on new methods and new approaches and topics that we're working on and eventually publishing on as well. So tonight I'm very pleased to welcome Grace Lees-Maffei, whose talk is entitled A Special Relationship, the UK-US Transatlantic Domestic Dialogue. Dr. Maffei is a reader in design history at the University of Hertfordshire, UK, where she chairs the TVAD research group, working on relationships between text, narrative, and image, and the Researcher Development Working Group. She's visiting professor on the MA Design Cultures at VU University, Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and was visiting professor for the Design Doctorate at IADE University in Lisbon, Portugal. Grace is managing editor of the Journal of Design History, and her research in the design history methodology and historiography has resulted in lots of books, and in fact we assign many of your readings in our courses in the programs throughout the courses. Some of them include Design at Home, Domestic Advice Books in Britain and the USA since 1945, Made in Italy, Rethinking a Century of Design, Italian Design, Iconic Designs, 50 Stories About 50 Things, Writing Design, Words and Objects, and the Design History Reader, which is just a fantastic resource for anyone interested in ideas, issues, and methods surrounding this event. Grace is also currently working on 2 books, Designing Worlds, National Design Histories in an Age of Globalization, co-edited with Chetzel Fallon, and Reading Graphic Design in Cultural Context, co-authored with Dr. Nicholas P. Maffei. So we are very lucky amidst all of this teaching, researching, writing, and publishing to have Dr. Maffei here with us tonight. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming to hear and speak about this special relationship tonight, which should be in inverted commas, as will become clear during the course of the lecture. So I want to preface what I say today by letting you know that what you will hear are my thoughts around methodology in relation to looking at the UK and the US as a field for my work on domestic advice. My book, Design at Home, took that field, the UK and the US, as its subject area, but left implicit the justification for doing that, really. So this is more of a kind of post-rationalization of a position that I took in that monograph. And it occupies 1 chapter in a book that Sarah mentioned, Designing Worlds, National Design Histories in an Age of Globalization, which I'm co-editing with Chetzel Fallon, that provides 14 other chapters that are similarly methodological reflections on the issues that are thrown up when we work on national topics in design history today. So the book is about not throwing the national baby out with the global bathwater, but my chapter is something something of a counterpoint to that, because rather than arguing in defence of national studies, I'm suggesting that design historians should do more transnational work. So that's the context for the thoughts that you'll hear today. And before I go any further, I want to just point out a couple of givens that my chapter will invite you to accept temporarily until the question and answer session, perhaps. One is to do with my use of terms. So I'm using, there's a great body of theory on the terms transnational, transcultural, and the way in which international intersects with those. I'm using transnational very simply to mean cultural work across borders. So international work allows borders to remain. Transnational work takes little account of geopolitical borders. So that's my working definition, not necessarily satisfactory. Another one is simply a kind of health warning around the use of the term nation. So I'll be talking about nations a lot, and I usually mean nation state when I use that term, but of course nations can exist within nation states and across nation states. So those are my kind of caveats, my givens that I'll be working with. Okay, so globalization, the state we're in, requires us to produce internationally situated investigations in which national design histories are understood within international contexts, that nations are not isolated entities. They have multi-directional dialogues, as I want to emphasize as a model for understanding cultural exchange, the notion of a dialogue with their neighbours, their friends, allies, their enemies, trading partners, etc. So a nation is not an isolated thing. And given the importance of these intranational liaisons, I think it's really strange that so many academic studies are bounded by national borders. And I think that that's convenient methodologically, but perhaps not acceptable anymore. So I think that we should challenge this tendency to national studies and instead think about what we can learn about the national through transnational study. Because I think in order to truly understand what, if anything, is distinctive about a nation, we need to leave it, perceive it from a distance, and appraise it from a conceptual Archimedean point. And I've done some work in that area in a book also co-edited with Sheff and Fallon that reappraised Italian design. My chapter was something of a counterpoint in that book because I was looking at what Italian design means in Britain. And I was questioning the production emphasis of the notion of made in Italy and suggesting that Italian design is at least as much made in Britain, New York, etc. The process of mediation is at least as important as the production process for providing us with understandings of what Italian design, for example, might be. National studies don't only have to be written from outside the nation in question or written by foreigners, as in my case, but design historians, I'll argue, should more often take the greater work involved in transnational studies, supranational regional studies, and comparative studies in order to better reflect the ways in which design is conceived, produced, mediated and consumed. Because design practice doesn't recognise those borders, so nor should we. And we're aware that design spaces, objects, images, processes are capable and indeed excellent at communicating national identity. But a characteristic of globalisation is increased and more rapid exchange of people, ideas, goods and services across national borders. So the consumption and mediation in one place of goods, images or ideas produced in another is a rich theme for historians of design and culture. And the three theoretical tools that I find continue to be useful in this are Fernando Ortiz's notion of transculturation, understanding the movement of goods, images and ideas as one that entails a process of acculturation on the part of producers, consumers and mediators. A second important theoretical tool for me has been, of course, Edward Said's critique of Orientalism, in which he, well, using literary sources, critiques a kind of exoticized representation of a generalized Middle and Far East that we can understand very clearly in design history through practices of chinoiserie, Japanisme, etc. And so this is a William Godwin sideboard and a Delft blue plate from the British potteries willow pattern. So the third tool I want to point to is Homi K. Barbar's post-colonial notion of hybridity as a dialogue between colonizer and colonized, rather than a more binaristic and inflexible relation of centre and margin. Marwan Crady has done some good, useful work continuing the exploration of hybridity as a space, and I quote, where intercultural and international communication practices are continuously negotiated in interactions of differential power. So Crady notes that this understanding of hybridity is informed both by critiques of cultural imperialism, which allow for hybridity as a form of resistance to domination, and warnings that hybridity and domination are not mutually exclusive. So this tendency to celebrate cultural hybridity that we've seen in the literature needs to be set against the fact that the implicated nations are often engaged in unequal power relations. So, transnational design history, in what I'm going to say today, is explored through the case study of domestic advice literature. And I'm defining that as textual and visual representations of the social and material home in etiquette, homemaking and home decoration books. And this body of material is intended for domestic readerships, doesn't explicitly communicate about national identity, but it communicates about national identity nevertheless, implicitly. And for me, therefore, it's a more intriguing resource for understanding how national identity works, because it's not the flags, the currency, the international exhibitions, the more explicit, concerted efforts at communicating national identity. This is stealth national identity. It's a nation speaking to itself about what the identity of that nation might be. Domestic advice books have a lot to tell us about national identity. There is a growing literature on domestic advice literature. There is an extensive literature on national identity, but the two haven't been brought together very much satisfactorily. Domestic advice books published in the UK and the US exemplify transnational patterns of influence as US domestic advice developed through a transatlantic dialogue with the UK, I'll suggest. So there are other influences at play here. I don't want you to think that my model is binaristic, but I want you to accept for the next hour that it's okay to pull the UK-US strand out of the spaghetti bowl of influences and interactions, and just look at that for a moment. So this dialogue that I'm positing is based on a shared language, English, and it's a dialogue that's been mutually informative, mutually constitutive, and proceeds from this position I've already stated, that national identity can't be understood in isolation. So, why are domestic advice discourses a good case study, other than the fact I've already mentioned that they're implicit? Why would I use that case study in thinking about transnationalism? Well, I think that advice literature is interesting as a tool of acculturation. So Sarah Levitt, for example, has written about the ways in which advice literature has been important as a tool of Americanization. She's discussed the role of, details within the home, as indicative of certain attitudes to national identity. And here I'm showing you a slide that isn't from her book, but in her book about domestic advice, specifically homemaking, the images don't show us the lace curtain that she writes really beautifully about. So I found you an image of a 1930s lace curtain to look at while I tell you what she says about lace curtains. So she explains that lace curtains were seen in the 1930s as a symbol of aspiring to join the middle class, a decorative detail employed by immigrants or the lace curtain Irish. And I quote, "To domestic advisors and to increasing numbers of Americans who encountered and learned from them, lace curtains represented the past, the unsanitary, stuffy, frilly 19th century. The modern 20th century, the age of efficiency kitchens and sparse furnishings, would welcome only those women who embrace the new ideals about American decoration." So she's writing about old Europe within modern America, and the micro-domesticity of the home and the macro-domesticity of the nation are fused in domestic advice discourses and domestic details. So the home is a microcosm of the nation, of course. How do we, having established that, how do we then learn more about it? Well, I suggest that we engage in close readings of domestic advice discourses. Domestic advice discourses provide us with clear manifestations of the otherwise elusive American dream. And I'm showing you here Betty Crocker's Guide to Easy Entertaining, How to Have Guests and Enjoy Them, from 1959 as an example of a depiction of the American dream. So you have a red roofed house, a landscape garden, manicured lawn, white picket fence, and then at the bottom, symbols of plenty and welcome, hospitality with the pineapples, a cornucopia of produce, and perhaps a Thanksgiving turkey. The national emphasis becomes problematic when it precludes adequate recognition of international or transcultural influences. So this focus on homemaking literature as constituting the home nation or a process of acculturation into national identity can lead to a tendency to address cultures other than a dominant normative mainstream, in this case North American national identity, only when those cultures appear in the country in question in the form of immigrants and can therefore be claimed as American, the other within America. So I'm talking about the way in which the American character of some practices, such as outdoor living, promoted in US home decorating books, is asserted rather than demonstrated comparatively. Domestic designs influenced by modernism, for example, can appear in a single nation study of American culture as more American than they might in a comparative study that would take in the European roots of modernism in arts and craft, Dutch distill, German functionalism, etc. And I suppose I'm suggesting that, the European roots of modernism that are so marked as to have become the subject of satire by, for example, Tom Wolfe, are occluded in single nation studies which see no need to trace roots for cultural tendencies outside the nation in question, other than perhaps in passing, because that's not what they're there to do. And I'm picking on Kathleen Ann McHugh here. Her book, American Domesticity, From How to Manual to Hollywood Melodrama, is guilty, I'd suggest, of asserting the American nature of some of the things she looks at, rather than convincingly tracing a lineage, convincing me of the particularly American nature of the material she's talking about. So I've looked at, Levitt's work incorporating immigrant stories, and now I'm pointing to the fact that to some extent Levitt's work, and McHugh certainly, forms part of a group of material that provides single nation histories of US cultural practices without necessarily recognising what Sue Currell has called the complex transatlantic crossings in her work, self-help discourses, but in domestic advice and domestic discourses and didactic discourses more broadly. So McHugh's looking at the visibility of housework in sources as diverse as 19th century advice books, Hollywood movies, and also experimental films as American domesticity rather than domesticity per se. So insights into the American condition, the American psyche, the American dream are implied but not necessarily delivered. I think that there is an extent to which the Americanness is assumed and fits a market for American studies curricula and interest in American identity, and it needs to be spelled out more explicitly as the result of transnational flows of ideas and ideals, particularly in relation to the transatlantic domestic dialogue that I'm positing. So I know that you know your American studies historiography better than I do, but to kind of understand why these single nation studies would seek to and get away with asserting Americanness, I have to look at the context of the development of American studies and think about the way in which American studies has undergone a transnational turn in the last few decades. So you have a rejection of American exceptionalism, and you have, for example, Janice Radway, ex-president of the American Studies Association, arguing for what she calls bifocal vision, a capacity to attend simultaneously to the local and the global as they are intricately intertwined, and she's arguing for a relational and comparative perspective. Now, for design historians, Radway's words there recall Anna Calvera's work on the local, the regional, the national and the global, and Calvera has argued for this similarly multiple perspective on geocultural phenomena. So Radway gave a kind of landmark presidential lecture in which she argued for this bifocal vision, And then she went on with 3 co-editors to present an anthology of American studies. Very interesting for me to see the way in which the history of American studies is packaged for the curricula in this book. And one of the most interesting parts of the book is the final section, which looks in detail at the transnational term. And this is my unforgivable death by bullet PowerPoint slide. There isn't another one like this, so please excuse me. I'm just glad it all fit on. I didn't think it would fit on your screen. But I'm not going to... so this is Robin Wiegman, 2009, in that anthology, looking at the various ways in which you might internationalize American studies. And I'm not going to deal with all of these. In fact, I'm positing my thoughts on this issue as being a contribution to number 5. But they are useful. They are, I think. So the ways in which you can internationalize include explicating the project of empire in US national state formation, rethinking identity formation as a material effect of the transnational history of US empire. You can engage in border studies, refuting notions of inside and outside that make nation formation distinct from transnational circulations of people, goods, labour, culture and knowledge. Very suggestive for design history. There is diaspora studies, the intersection of African American and African studies. Comparative studies to decenter the US from its universal representation as the quintessential national form, thereby locating operations of culture in cross-national formulations that are multinational in scope. The relation between the national and the international and the modes of knowledge production at work in American studies as a global scholarly enterprise, so globalized American studies, and collaboration and comparative analysis in the context of identificatory refusal with American studies. And thank you very much for your patience there. But I think that the transnational term has a nice clear literature, it's all spelled out for us, but it hasn't necessarily been assimilated by all the people working on American culture. So it's not news, it's not new, but nor is it totally redundant as a thing to think about, because we still need to be aware of the extent to which work in American studies continues to display, some of it continues to display this gravitation towards American studies. And of course, Radway has written about the American in American studies and what you might call American studies if you accept that the US and America are not equivalents. So, in this source, you have the closing word given to Donatella Izzo, who cautions that the opening of national frontiers and the erasure of national labels often seem to operate as a unilateral assumption theorized as a universal intellectual need from the vantage point of a privileged position within a strong institutional apparatus. So she's pointing out that this practice entails unacknowledged premise, authorizing and enforcing the reduction of multiplicity to unity. So that's the risk. And she counsels treatment of the nation as a historical and political category and a non-hierarchical approach to accessing the historically specific otherness of each individual other. So how do you account for the historical specificness of each individual other at once? Well, I want to move on from American studies and think about what it how it might mesh with the literature of design history. And if we look at scholarship in the design history of the US, we see an echo of the broader current of American studies in a shift from the articulation of an American aesthetic in the 2 sources on the left, to revisionist work, which shows the so-called American aesthetic to have been a transatlantic collaboration that embodied the conditions of modernity. And that last phrase is my husband's. That's McHugh writing about streamlining as an American aesthetic with European roots in a catalogue about Art Deco out of the V&A. So, writing on national identity and design more generally has tended to communicate convergence around national tropes rather than tracing divergence within national identities. And that same critique can be levelled at work on domestic advice. So national identity is the place where we come together in celebrations of our winning sports teams, in rituals of state leadership, such as presidential swearings in, royal coronations, royal weddings, and in national holidays. So I'm suggesting that national identity itself provides a tendency to convergence rather than divergence. But even while US national identity in particular is predicated upon diversity, the normalising function of domestic advice discourses tends to mean that a white middle-class ideal is published for assumed white middle-class readers to follow. And it hasn't allowed the close relationship between the physical home and the nation, which underpins domestic advice literature, to reflect the long-standing ethnic diversity of the US and the increasingly multicultural aspect of the UK population since the end of the Second World War. So the few academic studies to have focused on domestic advice have been hidebound, I suggest, by selective representations of national identity found in the source material. And then those secondary studies have similarly reflected the primary source's tendency to overlook cultural diversity. So how can we overcome this impasse? I suggest that we can borrow from reception theory and feminist literary theory the understanding that gaps and silences in domestic advice books are as semantically rich as what's said. And I'm pointing here to Emma Ferry's work in this special issue. Emma Ferry, in here, analyses British home decoration literature for its gaps and silences. I think that I'd recommend her essay, Decorators May Be Compared to Doctors, an analysis of Rhoda and Agnes Garrett's suggestions for house decoration and painting, woodwork and furniture, 1876, as a model for that approach. So we can extend that gaps and silences approach still further to national identity in design and design discourse. Because ethnic diversity is ignored in mainstream media treatments of domesticity, an analysis which reads between its lines to understand how ethnic and cultural diversities are encoded in domestic advice discourses may be fruitful. And so I was very pleased to see the publication of this book by Diane Harris, Little White Houses, How the Post-War Home Constructed Race in America. So Harris examines houses and their representations, textual and visual sources, mass market magazines, trade journals and catalogues for what they tell us of race in the USA and its construction through building and domestic practices in an era when all white housing developments typically excluded working class, African American, Jewish families, for example. Harris in this book confirms that post-war mainstream mass market publications depicted only white families and presented whiteness, broadly conceived, as normative, to the extent that non-whites are virtually invisible in the sources she examines. That Harris follows a relatively extensive body of theoretical writing on whiteness and sees race as encoded in words such as informality, casual lifestyle, leisure, individuality, privacy, uncluttered and even clean. So some of the qualities that writers such as McHugh are claiming as quintessentially American, Harris is showing to be essentially white. She perceives whiteness in the aerial perspective and axonometric views employed in architectural drawings, published as they were in magazine articles, advertisements and trade brochures. Because no viewer is defined or specified, Harris posits that the assumed viewer is white and middle class, because there's an assumption of a unitary collective identity that suppresses alternatives. Oh, and Harris mentions Slavoj Žižek's notion of ideological cynicism as a useful way of thinking about how post-war Americans were both aware of the ways in which economically valuable whiteness was instantiated in their homes, while at the same time regarding themselves as entirely unracialized and their spaces as race neutral. Now, I reviewed this book in the journal Design and Culture, so people who read that journal closely will already know that this book was a tremendous disappointment to me, because in the end, Harris has only consulted mainstream and therefore white media sources. And I thought that it would have been much more interesting, ultimately, if she had, provided the same careful, useful treatment of the representation of homes in, for example, Ebony magazine, which was founded in 1945, or other publications which might have revealed more about post-war ethnic diversity. What she has done is provided a demonstration of how difficult it is to read between the lines, because the risk is one of reproducing the ideological bias of mainstream media source material, so that a book critiquing whiteness in post-war US domestic advice furthers the discourse of whiteness. And I think that this approach is ultimately more limiting than the retrieval and analysis of sources from outside the mainstream, which speak more directly from and to the constituencies of interest. And there are a small number of very valuable examples of this kind of work. I'd just point to one here, Elizabeth Lash Quinn's analysis of prescriptions for interracial conduct from the 1960s to the 1990s of 1999, which makes a significant contribution to knowledge and understanding of how US ethnic diversity was addressed in a range of 20th century advice discourses, from the mainstream Hollywood movies that McHugh's written about, to etiquette guides for black and white readers respectively. And Lash Quinn writes very sensitively about aspects such as the treatment in these sources of awkwardness, inconsistency, optimism and latent prejudice. So her work is a model for design historians who want to be attentive to diversity in national identities, I'd suggest. So, while the cultural homogeneity of domestic advice writing and its failure to reflect the diversity of national markets into which books of domestic advice were published has been replicated in secondary analyses of domestic advice, the single nation emphasis in the domestic advice genre has not entirely precluded trans and multinational analyses, and I want to just briefly review several notable examples here. Firstly, the historical sociologist Norbert Elias produced the first extended transnational analysis of domestic advice. His oeuvre is significant in many ways, not least for his articulation of figuration sociology as a model in which individuals or personality structures are conditioned by social structures such as etiquette. Elias worked in Germany, the UK, the Netherlands and Ghana, and understood through that work that in order to analyse the structural place of individuals within society, it was necessary to examine more than one society. In the civilizing process, first published in 1939, after the Second World War, and then published in English in 1994, he used etiquette books published in Britain, Germany and France to trace increasing interdependence between individuals and states in Europe over the past 400 years. So Elias wants to emphasise the role of international trade in necessitating the maintenance of good relations between individuals, and a concomitant internalisation of social codes, which means we're all more self-disciplined and therefore we're able to maintain the appearance of increasing informality even in a climate of what he calls controlled decontrolling. So it may appear that society is more informal, but in fact it's more disciplined. So advice literature has been proposed as useful in understanding social interaction and international relations, not only by Elias, but also by the historian Arthur M. Schlesinger, Sr. in his 1946, end of the Second World War, study, Learning to Behave, which closes with this post-war call for etiquette as a route to improving international relations and maintaining world peace, because it can help people from different countries to show respect for one another. Now, Schlesinger really provides an exemplary and early account of the development of specifically American manners by looking at American etiquette books in the longue durée. So he looks at the way in which advice discourse was initially imported into the US from principally the UK and France. Then advice discourses were published in the US, but the texts were the same as the imported texts. Then there were modifications made to those texts, and then ultimately by 1830, what he calls specifically American manners. And a desire at that time to cast off imported superfluities of behaviour. So just as European codes of conduct reached a kind of flamboyant apogee in the Victorian period, books articulating specifically American manners were produced, which were concerned with living in the conditions of the New World. Lydia Maria Child's The American Frugal Housewife was published in 1829, and later on we can point to Dr. A.W. Chase's book Pioneers, advising pioneers on making frontier country habitable, 1873, published quite a few titles. So, C. Daggett Hemphill is also important as a kind of chronicler of American manners. So you have Schlesinger, Hemphill, but I'd also point to Linda Young's work on the... Linda Young is writing about Greater Britain and a middle-class ideal in the US, the UK, and Australia at once. And so her transnational study, I think, is very revealing in that she argues that the emergence of particularly North American modes of behaviour, distinct from European habits, didn't remove an evident interplay between European and US mid-20th century advice texts. Young makes the important distinction that the growth of genteel etiquette in the US encompassed one important differentiating condition: democracy. So that was the driver, because how could a system of manners grounded in class distinction have a place in a republic of equal citizens? American etiquette, Young argues, was a route to middle-classness more than aristocracy. And this insight, I'd suggest to you, derives purely from her comparative method. So I'm arguing that Young's account gives us an argument for transnational design histories because it leads to more profound conclusions, I guess. Again, Young's book isn't alone. It's one of several valuable transnational studies. George Arditi's Genealogy of Manners of 1998, I point to, and Kaz Wouter's Comparative Studies of Advice in the Netherlands, France, Britain and the UK in the 20th century are also relevant. Now, thinking about design discourse, homemaking discourse specifically, we can point to Penny Sparks' recognition that strong links were established between British and American decorating publications during this period of the flamboyant apogee, the Victorian period. Spark points to Charles Eastlake's Hints on Household Taste of 1868, which was enormously influential in the US on its publication there 4 years later. And she notes the correlation between the titles published collectively by Macmillan in Britain as the Art of Home series and the American writer Clarence Cook's influential manifesto about aestheticism in the household, The House Beautiful. So Spark observes that these publications in the 1870s and 80s on both sides of the Atlantic shared a commitment to the concepts of good taste, good workmanship and the importance of art in the home. And this convergence continued into the 20th century and persists today. So I'm giving you a few isolated examples, kind of notes towards a history of the transnational domestic dialogue. I'd also point to, for example, Emily Post's Etiquette, 1922, and every few years thereafter up until the present. Published on both sides of the Atlantic, as was Shirley Conran's Superwoman. So these are examples of transatlantic bestsellers in domestic advice discourse that have been published more or less simultaneously in the UK and the US. And I could also point to evidence of intertextual references in which advice writers routinely make reference to other advice writers. So you have, for example, Lady Trowbridge showing linguistic shifts. So there are examples of her work which are quintessentially aristocratic in tone, and other examples of her work which are more demotic and incorporate American idioms in an attempt to speak to a transatlantic audience. So this dialogic publishing activity reflects similarly convergent domestic practices in the UK and the US. For example, as a leading exponent of the application of efficiency studies and scientific management to homemaking, Christine Frederick exerted a transatlantic influence as well as a national one. So designer Margareta Lihotzky, who produced the Frankfurt kitchen, has acknowledged her debt to Frederick in designing the first fitted kitchen in 1926. So Frederick's book, 1920, 6 years later, the Frankfurt kitchen, a kind of a manifestation of her theory. And Frederick also influenced Emily Post. So this is an ideal kitchen arrangement from her book, The Personality of the House. So this rational domesticity underpinned the consumer movement on both sides of the Atlantic, which responded to the spread of consumerism seen in identification of new consumer groups such as the teenager. The consumer movement also responded to unease about the spread of consumerism. So you educate out of potential consumers any worries that you might have about the negative effects of consumerism. And so we see in domestic advice attempts to educate teenage consumers by engaging in quasi-professionalised design activities. And we see in the UK the BBC joining forces with the Council of Industrial Design to provide design education, which is also consumer education. So Americanization was a concern for domestic advice writers across a range of different markets. Julian Holder has written about this activity from the BBC. He said, while considerable effort by modernist design reformers was being put into influencing consumer behaviour, American films, music and products were forming much of the public's taste. The voice of the BBC, as the voice of the nation, was unable to combat the Americanisation of British taste during this century. And you have, for example, in Etiquette writing, authors ruling out Americanisations such as high as being definitely out. So the literature bears evidence of kind of discomfort felt in Britain in the face of the influence of American informality. And I've shown you at the beginning of the talk an example from the Duke of Bedford's Book of Snobs, an illustration by Nicholas Bentley that just embodies this unease about Americanisation. So you have a fuming aristocrat, British aristocrat on the left, just appalled by the over-familiarity and brash appearance of this friendly American. So, American advice writers were in turn self-conscious about what they regarded as distinctly American habits. So you have California teachers Betty Allen and Mitchell Perry-Briggs writing in If You Please, a Book of Manners for Young Moderns. It seems to be a part of the American philosophy to welcome variety and change. In dress, we quickly discard the old and eagerly grasp the new. And in Behave Yourself, Etiquette for American Youth, they write, good grooming is as much a part of modern life as is streamlining. So informal manners have been presented in this literature as an American national trait. Not only in British domestic advice literature with its implied fear of Americanisation, but also in US produced titles invested in the idea of American manners. And you see a kind of debate around what American manners should be in, for example, Mary and Russell Wright's Guide to Easier Living, which has a lot of international influences. I don't want to provide a binaristic sense that this is only about the UK and US dialogue. There's also, strong East Asian influences here. But the way in which they dismiss Emily Post is very interesting. So Emily Post is indicative of an outmoded, anglicised approach to behaviour that is redundant, basically, and they're offering instead American easier living specifically. So, Victoria Grazia, for example, has written about the resounding victory of Americanisation, but I want to suggest that two-way traffic is a better metaphor, or the dialogue I've mentioned, or a crossroads, or a pile-up of multiple influences. Recognition of greater complexity in Americanisation we've seen provided by Sarah Levitt, but if we look beyond domestic advice, we can look at the work of several other design historians that are providing what we might call transnational or transcultural design histories. So, how am I doing for time, Sarah?
How are you doing with your...
Well, I think, because I've been talking for nearly an hour, I think I'll wrap up now. Yeah, and I think, I'll stop. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Grace. We have some, I know it's a lot to take in, but we have some time for questions to talk a little bit more about some of these issues, or comments, perceptions, elaborations. It's always hard to ask the first. Yes.
With the Marion Russell Wright guys and to sort of want to, I guess, live easier in America, was there any of that in Britain as well?
Very much.
Okay.
So, I mean, that's one of the interesting things about this, that you have American domestic advisors positing informality as quintessentially American, and you have US domestic advisors trying to persuade Brits to adopt more informal and therefore modern, up-to-date modes of social interaction, and the extent to which they, in the UK, are having to manage the association of informality with American behaviour is very, very interesting. So in some instances, you know, you can almost see that behaviours are recommended because they're American, you know, but in others, that aspect would be minimised. So there's a love-hate relationship with the US in the post-war period, because there is both enthusiasm and aspiration on the one hand and fear on the other. And so, you know, if my transatlantic domestic dialogue is one hidebound by imperialism, it's an imperialism that ricochets backwards and forwards across the Atlantic in different ways. So you have actual colonialization replaced by the soft power of cultural imperialism. And then, you know, how that plays out in our own century is interesting too.
So most of the, I guess, guides suggesting more casual things were coming from the US?
Yes, I mean, I think, as I said, they was more or less explicit about that, but I think that it was, you know, when you look at the newspaper treatments of this kind of moral panic around Americanization, when you bring those discourses together, you can see that it was implicit in some sources, but never absolutely absent. Yes?
I have two questions. The first is, given your discussion, and I've completely enjoyed your presentation for a reason I'll highlight in the second question. But the first question is, with your discussion of the transnationality and comparing the informality between U.S. self-perception and exported perception and vice versa, I wonder how what Thomas Hein has talked about in Populux, how that maps onto that. Because in Populux, he's reflecting on the 50s and the development of that term, which is, of course, looking more at what you were saying about the U.S. hybrid of popularity, what is popular, but luxury. Yeah. So popular luxury, not really having to do with aristocracy, like sure. that relationship of domesticity and social aspiration in England. Here, it's just this odd combination of what is both popular, perhaps informal, but also luxurious at the same time. And what he was looking at in particular was the phenomena, that's not just a static cultural assessment. He was looking at that as a byproduct in the United States, specifically of greater mobility, of the emergence of suburbs, and therefore things like potato chips and potato chip dips and waffle chips, which take dips better and don't break. So the form was related very much to the functionality of having to ready-make food to entertain your neighbors, who you may not know because you all just moved to the same cul-de-sac. So the informality is directly produced by the cultural diaspora inside. So how does that actually map into England? Because my one fear that I'm having is that the binary, and I know you were very cautious to try not to be too binary about it, but that one can evolve where it's about informality, and the other is that this is actually produced by what's evolving in the culture.
So, is your question about how my model of a transatlantic domestic dialogue accounts for cultural specificity in each of the
Yes, and some things that are emerging from industrialization and other related social phenomena that are they really culturally bound, or is that perhaps more transnational or specifically grounded?
Yeah, I mean, that I think is a really enormous question, and I want to come back to this notion of your understanding of my model as binary, because what I've been trying to argue is for a third thing. So my model, I'm not here today to advocate that we all do a lot more international design history. I'm here to advocate that we do a lot more transnational design history. The difference being, as I said at the outset, the extent to which you're accounting for borders, geopolitical, geocultural borders. So I'm suggesting that hovering over the Atlantic is the fruits of this domestic dialogue, the third thing that's produced, that is much more amorphous. So, to go back to your example of cul-de-sacs and potato chips, whatever industrial economic context produced those didn't preclude their adoption in the UK as symptomatic of informality. You know, but it's enormously complicated because informality as a kind of something that post-war Americans and Brits would aspire to has a direct correlative in the aristocratic notion of ease. So the idea that you mustn't look as if you've tried hard, you must look as though everything is effortless, because the more effortless it is, the more convincing you are in your presentation that this is innate to you. Because what's innate is the opposite of what's learned, you know. So I just think it's very complicated, and I suppose that I'm giving you an entirely unsatisfactory answer.
No, it's actually quite beautiful, because the source of that, you can take back 500 years to one of the earliest etiquette books, which is the Book of the Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione, where he's saying literally dissimulation and what was in Italian sprezzatura, the ease of performance of that is the root of actual acculturation. And whether that's belonging to the nobility in an Italian court, that's really at the heart of the matter, and that continues 500 years later through these different clothes and habits and books and more.
Absolutely, it's the contradiction at the heart of the domestic advice genre. The extent to which ease can be delivered in book form is questionable.
Now we have Kabbalah that you can read with your fingertips. The second question, and I don't want to monopolize, but the second question is more taking this and contextualizing it right now through design education itself, because there was an interesting point you made when the actual evolution in the 1970s, etc., you had a couple of images that through amateurs and children starting to place quasi-professional designer acts, you prepare a new culture and new generations as consumers.
Yeah.
by actually reducing perhaps the critique of consumerism. And I wonder, and this has long been a question for me, in our own, at Parsons, as we look at design education and design learning as a method of critical thinking, and how that is carried around the world and transmitted in different parts of the world, that is generating new generations of consumers. India, China, other parts of the world that haven't been able to consume so much previously. What are we actually producing with our design education of critical thinking? Are we producing critical thinking, or are we generating the self-satisfying means of the next age of consumers?
I'm just a design historian. But, you know, I like the line of questioning. I mean, does anyone else have an answer for what we're doing right now around
How
the
about
world?
some designers here who are here today, who are taking these classes, and thinking about these things?
What do you guys think about it? We're developing these curricula to help critical thinking, quote unquote, all these great sounding things. What do you guys think about it?
Is it working?
Does it make you critical, or does it whet your appetites to?
It makes me more critical.
Okay.
Definitely more critical. I used to just like to shop, and now I can't shop without feeling guilty.
So that's good. That's very good.
It just needs more design.
These are very complicated questions, and there's a lot to think about. Maybe we can think about them a little more informally over a glass of wine. Does anyone have any other questions before we?
I mean, I just come back to you having had a moment to think, and what you might decide to do is posit, compare a formal design education that's encouraging critical thinking in design with an informal, collective critical consumption that's encouraging, you know, critical thinking, but albeit in much more informal ways. And I'm thinking about Occupy, for example, and, you know, Buy Nothing Day as examples. They're crowdsourced models of critical thinking, perhaps, outside of formal education. Correlative.
Oh, do you want to have one?
A quick question. Well, I love Robert's sort of synthesis of our concerns as faculty here and what you're bringing, which is absolutely enriching all of that for us. But my question was, I guess, less philosophical, but more about pattern books, because I wonder, you know, is there a connection between is there a long tradition of pattern books in England, and what's the relation between the pattern book and the advice book?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you could look at Chippendale, for example. Yeah,
18th century.
Yeah. So what's interesting about the pattern book is that it has two audiences. You know, designers who are going to use the patterns as models, and consumers who are going to say, I want one of those, please. And so, yeah, I mean, we could look at domestic advice discourse, which concerns the home in all sorts of ways, as a kind of consumer education and as a discourse allied to increasingly formalized design education. And we could think about Pugin's book, Contrasts, you know, as another example of a design reformer speaking to other designers in a way that educates consumers, raises the level of design critique in that moment. And we could trace that, you know, to the Great Exhibition, and then the setting up of the South Kensington Museum, which had as its remit the education of designers, but which also did a great deal to educate consumers.
But I meant more pattern books, sort of by non-professionals, not by the design elite, not by those guys, but, you know.
Amateur patterns.
Yes, exactly.
I don't know anything about those.
Okay.
All right. I mean, and this is for later too, but then the advent of also design magazines, international design magazines, would be a very interesting direction to think about this as well, this transnationalism that is crossing over.
Oh, my Fitbit's
Well done.
I've done a lot of but no, the axis of professionalisation and amateur practice is absolutely fascinating. And I've written on professionalisation in relation to interior design specifically, but not in relation to, for example, furniture design or architecture, because that work, you know, is done by other people. It's very current as well.
Yes. What do you mean?
In the era of prosumption.
Okay.
Yeah, one of our questions.
I just have one question. So, how does text like Betty Friedan's like feminine mystique, how does that conflict like dissolve?
Sorry, I can't
Oh,
understand
can you hear me? I'm sorry. How does text like Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique like affect or dissolve the relationship internationally between these ideas that have been brought up in all of these texts we were previously talking about that were so effective in both nations?
Yeah, so the feminine mystique was consumed in both nations, was influential in both nations, and has a design dimension because it's about what happens to women in the home and what kinds of homes are, you know, have unfortunate consequences for the women inside them. But what kind of answer are you looking for?
I was just wondering, because we were talking about all these like mannerisms and things that are brought up in all these other books that have previously built up kind of what international people, I guess, think of like the American perspective, and then feminine mystique kind of went in and dissolved all those and was saying, you know, hey, there's like things that aren't really true about that. So I was wondering if that like internationally affected how people thought of Americans and like those mannerisms they had previously assumed were true.
Yes, I don't know. I haven't looked at the history of the reception of the Friedan book, but I suppose your starting point for doing that could be that in the UK it might be received as an American story, but it might be received as a story that has relevance for British women as well. Both at once.
Great. Thank you.